If you were one to go to Sunday school as a kid, you probably have heard this following story before. It makes a really easy, simple skit of three people. So Sunday school teachers like it a lot because they can just read and kids can do their thing. I actually wouldn't be surprised if Once Upon a Time Hot Metal did this too, because it's a good story. But here is 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1 through 10. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. At that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his room. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called, "Samuel, Samuel." And he said, "Here I am," and ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call. Lie down again." So he went and lay down. The Lord called again, "Samuel." Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call, my son. Lie down again." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel again, a third time. He got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, "Go, lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Now the Lord came and stood there, calling as before, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." Now, I would be shocked if your Sunday school teacher told you this next part. I would be less shocked if it was included in Hot Metal's version, but that I assume happened once upon a time. Here's verses 11 through 20. Then the Lord said to Samuel, "See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make both ears of anyone who hears it tingle. On that day, I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken about concerning his house from beginning to end. For I have told him that I am about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God and he did not restrain them. Therefore, I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be expiated by sacrifice or offering forever." Samuel lay there until morning. Then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. But Eli called to Samuel and said, "Samuel, my son." He said, "Here I am." Eli said, "What was it that he told you? Do not hide it from me. May God do so to you and more also if you hide anything from me of all that he told you." So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. Then Eli said, "It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him." As Samuel grew up, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet of the Lord. This is the word of God, word of life. Thanks be to God. So you can probably already tell why your Sunday school teachers stopped where they did. Those first 10 verses are a really nice story about how God calls young people, and we just have to discern that it's God calling and say, "Oh, here I am." And wouldn't that be nice if the story just stopped there? Wouldn't it be nice if all call stories were the calling and the saying of yes, and then everything going smoothly? But poor Samuel is called and then almost immediately regrets it. Because what he is called to proclaim is the destruction of his mentor and his family. He has to look this man in the eye, this man who is at least nominally a leader of his people, not a great one, but a leader of his people, and say, God is disappointed and it is not looking good. And Eli, to his credit, seems to take this in stride because he knows the truth, that he has failed as a leader and his sons have committed terrible crimes and abuses of power. If Eli is really honest with himself, Samuel telling him this hard truth becomes a relief, even if it's painful. And then this is the reputation that Samuel develops as one that doesn't let words fall to the ground. He is bold in his honest proclamation of what God reveals to him, no matter how hard it is for the people to hear. He is trustworthy because he doesn't hide the truth, even if it's hard. And in his tenure as prophet and judge of Israel, Samuel will sometimes speak the truth that the people really don't want to hear. Like when they demand a king, and Samuel says, "Ooh, that's not a good idea," and they force him to do it anyway, and then it turns out Samuel was right. Doesn't end well. But Samuel always remains committed to speaking the truth from God. He keeps showing up and answering the call. This weekend, as we've mentioned, as a nation, we remember one of our greatest prophets, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And there is a tendency to sanitize Dr. King, I will admit, especially in white communities. There is a narrative about King that praises him for speaking out in favor of civil rights, of his promotion of nonviolence, of his dream. And yet we then neglect to mention his larger call for systemic change, or the fact that his nonviolence also meant breaking laws, or of the actions that he demanded that we take in order to make the dream a reality. And I've mentioned before, every year on this weekend, I read Letter from a Birmingham Jail as a white clergy leader, and I find it still speaks hard truths to me. But this year, I felt a craving for later Dr. King, where he gets a little more punchy in his rhetoric in his life. And so I also read this speech from 1967 titled Beyond Vietnam. He gave this speech almost a year to the day before he was assassinated, and a few years after the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Act were signed into law. So there were a fair number of people who were wondering why he was still speaking out, especially about the war in Vietnam. That didn't really have anything to do with civil rights, quote unquote, right? Like people thought that. And so lots of people told him it wasn't his place. And he was speaking out against President Johnson, who had been an ally, who had been the one to sign those seminal laws. And this is going to be a lengthy quote that I'm going to say. I was tempted just to say the whole thing, and Tim advised against that. But I invite you to settle in and hear these words from Dr. King. A time comes when silence is betrayal. That time has come for us in relation to Vietnam. The truth of these words is beyond doubt, but the mission to which they call us is a most difficult one. Even when pressed by the demands of inner truth, men do not easily assume the task of opposing their government's policy, especially in time of war. Nor does the human spirit move without great difficulty against all the apathy of conformist thought within one's own bosom and in the surrounding world. Moreover, when the issues at hand seem as perplexing as they often do in the case of this dreadful conflict, we are always on the verge of being mesmerized by uncertainty. But we must move on. Some of us who have already begun to break the silence of the night have found that the calling to speak is often a vocation of agony, but we must speak. We must speak with all the humility that is appropriate to our limited vision, but we must speak. And we must rejoice as well. For surely this is the first time in our nation's history that a significant number of its religious leaders have chosen to move beyond the prophesying of smooth patriotism to the high grounds of a firm dissent based upon the mandates of conscience and the reading of history. Perhaps a new spirit is rising among us. If it is, let us trace its movement and pray that our inner being may be sensitive to its guidance. For we are deeply in need of a new way beyond the darkness that seems so close around us. Unfortunately, I don't know that we have stayed on a steady path where people of faith readily hear the call to speak out. But I know many of us try because of what we learned from leaders like King, who knew that the call of God was both a vocation of agony, right? Like, I'm going to get that tattooed somewhere. Vocation of agony and a vocation of joy. That speaking the truth of God might be hard. It might not win you any friends. Indeed, it might get you put up on a cross. But it is only doing that we fulfill our call and can experience new life. Speaking and doing what God has put on our hearts is the only way to acknowledge the call to us. Today, as soon as we're done with this, we are going to ordain and install those who God, through this community, has called to be leaders. And my hope is that they don't as quickly regret that call as Samuel did. I hope you don't wake up in the morning and say, oh gosh, what have I done? But I also don't want to pretend like this call is going to be easy. Leading a community of people during a pandemic into a new way of doing church is no easy task. Finding ways to connect with people and show compassion when we cannot actually touch one another and all the forces of the world seek to divide us is increasingly difficult. Speaking the truth of God in a world that seems to not want to hear truth or indeed not even know what truth is anymore is near impossible. Perhaps the biggest task, balancing the budget based on giving when people don't have enough money to give. Here I am, Lord, might be the only response, hoping that God takes it from there. Those we will ordain and install, along with those who have already been serving on the various teams of this community, will answer this call. Ensure they're not leading a nation or a movement, but I hope they will all see this as a time where they can speak the truth and put into action what God has put on their hearts and on the heart of this community. May they strive to embody the spirit of Samuel and Dr. King and all the prophets and all the disciples, and most importantly, embodying the spirit of Jesus on this new path that we set out on as leaders and truth tellers. And may we all support and accompany them on that journey. Amen.